Hello there, my name is Chris Kerswell. I form part of the solution engineering team here at Redgate, and today I want to take you through our SQL Monitor demo portal. What that means is I'm going to show you how to access the site, how to get around, some of the features and some of the key things we like to show on the site, and a very quick overview of SQL Monitor as part of that process as well. All right then, so let's open Google Chrome or any web browser, to be honest, but I've always been a fan, and I'm going to go to you can see it come up in my suggestions, monitor.red-gate.com. monitor.red-gate.com. So that is the URL that you need to access the demo site, and what you'll see when you hit that is this right here. So this web page. So this is our preview version of the product. It's running off of essentially the same code base, but there's a couple of extra configuration options we've enabled to put it in like this demo only mode. And so to begin with, that means it's wrapped in this tour enabled feature. So you can have a look around, start the tour, or you can just browse. So I'm just going to hit just browse. If you would like a guided tour, please hit start the tour. All right then, so now I have access to the demo portal. This essentially is an overview of SQL Monitor as of the latest available version that we've shipped to the demo site. So that is usually put out around about a week or so after our main release. So we continuously update this as well, which means it's a great place to go if you just want to see the latest and greatest, essentially. Just for convenience, I'm going to now make this full screen with F11. But make no mistake, this is all running within browser. All right then. So what you see here are a selection of servers that we have set up and monitored for demo purposes. I'm just going to give you an overview of some of the more interesting things on this. Now we've grouped these by 4 different allocations. So you have production, Azure database, staging, test, and then we have this quite unusual group at the bottom, simulation. So they also have different purposes, really. Our top group is actually a production set of servers. So you're actually seeing some of the live monitoring that's happening to some of our components. Specifically, you might see reference to SSCDB-N2 and SSCDB-N1. That essentially, SSC is essentially that stands for SQL Server Central. So if you've ever used the SQL Server Central web page, then you might find that interesting, that you can actually see what the SQL Server in the back end is doing live using that. We've grouped this into 1-production. So the group name here is 1-production. Just note that you don't actually need to use the number naming convention as we have here. You could name this whatever you want. If we wanted, we could call this SQL Server Central. If we wanted, we could call it Europe. Whatever. It doesn't really matter. The next group we have is a selection of Azure databases. So it's not the biggest grouping or selection of Azure databases you will have ever seen. One thing to pay attention to, so you've got the cloud icon that appears, and that just highlights that this is a cloud-specific instance, effectively. So we represent it as a tile instance, even though it might not be an instance per se. So that's for an Azure database, or an Elastic pool, or a managed instance, or a Amazon equivalent of a managed instance. So that'll be Amazon RDS. We've got some staging environments. They're not particularly interesting, but the ones that I find particularly interesting are these workload servers under this test grouping. So you can see we've currently got 4 testing environments, 2 workload and 2 testing. And why these are interesting is that here we have actually simulated some workload to represent some interesting stories and some interesting bits of functionality, so you can see what this would look like in a real life scenario. Well, hopefully not an actual real life scenario, because we've essentially crafted these servers to be as problematic as possible. And then finally, we have this 9 simulation area. So in this particular area, you can see how many servers you could add, or an overview of what a large number of servers would look like. These are not actual servers being monitored, I will stress that. So these are, well, as the name suggests, simulated servers. So what that means is that they are effectively dummy servers. And we do have this prompt as well that will come up. So if you like what you see from having a look at the demo site and you would like to either speak to someone directly or download a free trial, then you can follow the links there. So yeah, try not to select any of these servers for closer inspection. There's nothing wrong with doing that inherently. It's just not hugely interesting. And the data that's there isn't actual real live data. Okay then, so let's have a closer look at some of these. First of all, we can actually select one of these to have a closer look at. So the SSCDB N1 or SSCDB N2, as I said, they might be particularly of interest. One thing to note of there, and again, you've got an icon that's highlighted here, is that we have a high availability group working over these nodes. That's why we've got node 1, node 2, and you can actually access that live from here. So I can go navigate to, and then I can navigate to the availability groups we've got running on here, or actually have a look at the cluster overview page by selecting that option. I'm actually going to jump into the workload server so we can have a closer look at the simulated workload that we've got against us. I say simulated, this is an actual SQL server that's running, but it's been doctored effectively by our engineering team so that it does some things that you really wouldn't want to see. Okay, so let's have a look at a few examples of that. First of all, at the top, we have our, we call it the top graph internally. It's effectively giving me an overview of the key metrics across this instance. So I can see, I don't know, how the CPU or the memory or the I/O is generally doing. The CPU is pretty low, but pretty variable. I/O is interesting because this is kind of spiking quite a lot. And I might want to say, put a baseline on that I/O. Very useful if you want to get a sense of what normal or what good looks like. And we then have the actual queries that are running. And as a reminder, if you haven't played with SQL Monitor directly before, this scrubbing bar that I'm moving at the top across the graph, this actually controls how much information you're seeing across the rest of this page. So if I spread this out, I'm going to be tracking more information rather than if I compress it down. We can also change our time range right here. So if I want to say, look at, I don't know, last week, yesterday, then I can do that very easily. But yeah, there are some queries in here that are a bit suboptimal, you could probably say. Again, they've been specifically coded to not be so great. And you can see examples of those by selecting the query itself. And here you can then see what weights are affecting this query. We've actually run some code analysis over the query as well. So you can see 4 issues that were highlighted here. For example, running select star. And if we hit view query plan, you can have a look at that query plan. So there are some specific queries in here that will be more interesting than others. So have a flick around, see what you can find. I believe this query is a very small query for sure, but it's running some interesting seek and scan operations, which means it can be quite variable. You also see the history at the bottom. So this can be very interesting if you're looking at seeing effectively how changes, for example, to the query plan have affected the running of this query long term. Speaking of, on the graph itself, there are orange marks every time that query plan has changed. Okay, scrolling down, another quite interesting thing to have a look at specifically on the demo site is the TempDB section. So again, we've put into the workload server a variety of variable elements, is probably the polite way of putting it. Some things that you probably wouldn't want to see happening in TempDB. So a great example of this can be found by looking at the open sessions. So you can see specifically what sessions are running in TempDB and actually expand that out for more information. We can see the version store usage. We can see which logins are coming in here. And this is one that I find particularly interesting because most of this is running under system as a user, which is probably not what we'd want. We have a section for blocking processes. And again, we've got some blocking that we've mocked up here. So this is intentional blocking, and you can tell that quite easily by seeing that there's a lot of wait for delay that's happening here. And that allows us to show you what this blocking process section could look like. And you can see the full blocking tree all the way up to the head blocker. And then we have the processes themselves, followed by at the bottom, the actual databases that are running on this instance. So you can have a closer look again by the individual databases. For example, Stack Overflow from 2013. And here I can see one of those queries specifically running against that individual database. We also have a collection of mock alerts running across the entire estate. So again, you can see some blocking that we've got running here, as well as some deadlocks. So you can see that this is being flagged up against some of those test servers. Okay, so if we have a look at one of these, you can see the alert format. This is essentially like an inbox style alert system. So you can take this, you can mark it as read or unread, clear or unclear. In the full implementation, this is of course not unblocked, but for the demo site, we have restricted that. So that's one slight difference. But yeah, feel free to click around, see what this would look like. You have the option to escalate this out by email. As I said, clear it off, manage the alert as you would once you're satisfied that this event is no longer affecting your system. Another place that's really worth checking out on the demo portal is our estate page. So here we have, again, those simulated servers giving you an overview of what this full estate page essentially would look like with a larger estate. For example, here you can see that we've got some very old servers, SQL Server 2008, that are very behind in terms of latest updates. So we can find those very easily by looking at the actual statuses, seeing when the mainstream support is maybe coming to a close. And then we actually provide the links to the available updates here as well. Similarly, we have a simulated sample of data across the disk usage section for the estate as well. So you'll be able to see what an estate disk usage graph would look like. So while we wait for that to load, so that graph at the top, and then what's important here is tracking the projected change and time until full to make sure that there's no specific drives that are going to breach the capacity you have. But looking at this at the high level, it looks generally like we're mostly under capacity by quite some way, but we have had a big jump. So that was adding in those servers. But you can always drill down to a specific environment. So for example, if I want to look at my SQL Server DBN1 server and look at the C drive that's running there, then this will allow me to just focus on that server and indeed that specific drive. So not only can we see the current capacity, not only can we see the historic use, but we can project into the future what that will look like. So if your projected usage is higher than your current capacity, then that's something you're going to want to actively manage. Now, of course, we can monitor that proactively rather than using, say, a graph or a report to track that through systems like alerts. So the alert screen itself, you can configure an alert that will fire off a disk usage alert if a certain capacity does get breached. So here we go. That's an example of what this graph would look like. In this case, we're looking pretty golden. So the capacity is generally being used incrementally more and more and more, but we don't have to worry about replacing that disk imminently. The final section I want to move on to is the SQL Agent Job section. So this can be really useful if you want to know which jobs failed or succeeded over the last week, 24 hours, because sometimes it can be very hard to track back and find that one failed execution. Now in this case, we have a failure, I can see that right here, against that SQL Server Central DBN1. We can actually see what that was. That was a SQL backup. Looks like a transaction backup failed about 8:30. So that's something that I may want to proactively fix. In this case, it looks like the SQL agent just carried on, and that didn't prevent it from executing later stages. Finally, in the configuration section, you can see various settings that will be used to configure a full implementation of SQL Monitor. Again, for the demo site, we have locked off some of this, so you can't actually make any permanent changes, as you would probably expect. For example, here, if I go to the monitored servers and go to Add SQL Server, I'll be able to add in all of the information, but I won't actually be able to add or test that connection. That's true for, well, essentially all of the permanent changes on the configuration screen. Something else you might find interesting here is under data management. So here you can see not only the data management settings we can configure and change, but also the actual capacity that this is taking on disk. So that is the size of the SQL Monitor data repository. One thing to note here, as I said, we have simulated data for a lot of these servers, so this is more true for the non-simulated servers than the rest. But yeah, in a full configuration of SQL Monitor, our clients will most of the time be changing these to specifically suit their environment. So storing some things for longer than we would provide the setting for out of the box, or less, essentially according to what is of interest. Some people are much more interested in keeping, say, the top queries data around for longer than others. And some things are just naturally heavier. The SQL trace, for example, is an example of something that is extremely heavy. So we really recommend you don't keep that unless you effectively have unlimited storage. All right then, so that's a quick overview of the demo portal. Any further questions, please feel free to reach out and let us know. Always happy to help people out and effectively get as much of their SQL Server estate covered as possible. So my email address is available there. Otherwise, please feel free to leave a comment below and we'll get in touch as soon as we can. Hope you have a great day. Speak to you soon.